Can't be that old. Good morning, committee.
Sweet.
Today is Friday, January 20th, 2023. This is the morning meeting of the House Appropriations Committee. Our chair, Diane Lanfer, is at another meeting, so I will be attempting to run the show this morning. Just so everybody knows where we are going to be starting with Agency of Education testimony from Jill Briggs Campbell regarding federal funds and ESSER, all about. At 9 o'clock, we have the Department of Environmental Conservation in. At 10 o'clock, Sarah Clark from JFO is going to talk to us about the web report and some other things that are going to be your new best friends in the reporting and finance world. At 11 o'clock, the Department of Public Service, Christine Hallquist, so I imagine we'll be talking about broadband. Then we have lunch. Then we have the governor's budget address at 1 in the well of the House. And then we'll probably want to come back here. There should be copies of the executive summary of the governor's budget report here. And we'll do our final cleanup because this is the last day in this room for this week. And we're moving, as you know, to a different room next week while the Sergeant at Arms and other folks it's a looking office, so a committee room. So we're lots happening today. So with that, I think we'll start. And Jill, if you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go around and introduce ours.
Sure thing. Jill Briggs Campbell, Agency of Education. Hopefully I am the simplest and most straightforward piece of your agenda today, having heard it sounds like a very busy Friday. Thank you all for having me this morning.
Great. Thanks for coming. And Rebecca, we'll start with you and go around.
Rebecca Holcomb from Norwich, Sharon Stratford and Bedford.
Woody Page from Newport.
Trevor Squirrel, Underhill and Jericho.
From Plainfield, Marshfield, and Calais.
Lynn Dickinson, St. Albans Town.
Carrie Dolan, Duxbury, Facein, Moortown, Waitsfield, and Warren.
Pat Brennan, Colchester.
And I'm Robin Shive from Middlebury. And on the screen we have.
Yeah, good morning. Jim Harrison, Chittenden, Mendon, Killington, and Pittsfield. Welcome.
Great. And
Tristan Tolino, Brattleboro.
All right. I think that's everybody that we're going to have today. So why don't you take it away, Jill?
Wonderful. So I will sort of take a step back. I never assume that anybody, all of the acronyms I'll throw at you, although we're a couple of years in now, so ESSER funds may be familiar. But I'm here to speak with you today about some language that the Agency of Education is asking for in the Budget Adjustment Act. I know that Commissioner Gresham and Sarah Clark were speaking to you about it, I think, last week. So taking that step back, what we're talking about is the ESSER, Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds. There have been 3 of these. These are funds to directly support our supervisory unions and supervisory districts, which in federal speak are LEAs. So you'll hear me use those interchangeably. And those came out in 3 tranches. So initially, the CARES Act of 2020, districts received about $28 million in ESSER 1 funds. And of the tranche of funds that comes in, the Agency of Education is able to hold 10% for state level priorities. So the districts receive $28 million through a formula grant that goes directly to the districts. It's not competitive. The formula is determined by the U.S. Department of Education. And then the agency reserved $3 million roughly of the ESSER $1. Then in December of 2021, the Carissa Act came through, and that included ESSER 2 funds. So of ESSER 2, we had $114 million that went to our supervisory unions and districts, and the state retained around $14 million of that. And then finally, just when we thought historic funding, then the ARPA Act came through in March of 2021. And that was substantially more, about $156 million out to districts, and then the state received about $28 million. So all in.
The last part.
The last one, $28 million.
retained out of
Out of
150.
156, yeah.
And when was ESSER 1? ESSER 2 was 1220.
Yes, ESSER 2 was 1220, ESSER 1 was the CARES Act, March 2020.
Yeah. How much did that, was that total?
It was 28 million to the districts and about 3 million to the
you.
state.
Okay, thank you.
So total of 45 million retained.
Just about 45 million, yeah, say 44. And of that 44 million that's retained, there is also a reserve within that for what's called direct admin. So that's money that's held by the agency to essentially try to manage all of this. So that tends to be direct administrative costs. For example, we've used it to contract for some project coordinators, which are my support team, to keep me sane as we try to manage essentially $500 million of funding.
And so if I could interrupt, Jill, how much was that reserve within the
So
34 million?
The ESSER 1, and I'll also talk briefly about the sort of periods of performance, so when these end. ESSER 1 funds actually ended September 30th of this year. So those are done for all intents and purposes. Their final closeout that the agency is required to do is in 8 days. So they'll be done. And of that, we reserved something like 155,000.
Okay.
ESSER 2, our admin reserve is about 630,000. And ARP ESSER, it's about 1.4 million. And I'll actually be speaking to that a little bit today
Could
as
you go
well.
back over those numbers again?
Sure.
ESSER 2 was
So-
the reserve.
ESSER 2, the admin reserve
Yeah.
is about 630,000. And the ARP ESSER, the ESSER 3 is about 1.4 million.
And the ESSER one was 155.
155, yeah. 155,000, yes.
So 1.2 million admin reserve for a total, what was the total investment? I guess I could just add the numbers up.
Sorry, for the ARP ESSER, it's 1.4 million. And I have some handy charts I'm happy to send you all as well.
Oh, yes, sorry.
Could you just give the end dates for ESSER 2
Yes,
and ARP ESSER?
so ESSER 2 ends September 30th of this year, 2023. And ARP ESSER ends September 30th of 2024. And so let's talk briefly about what that means in terms of, potential reversion of funds back to the federal government. And this applies to both the districts and to the Agency of Education. So those deadlines are the deadline by which we must obligate the funds. So for the federal sort of definition here, an obligation means we've got a contract, the person has been hired, the HVAC work has been completed by those deadlines. There is a little bit of debate, I will say, happening at the national level around whether or not performance can continue after those deadlines, but that is not settled in any way. So we're being quite conservative about that. So for all intents and purposes, the districts and the Agency of Education need to have fully obligated all of their funds by those September 30th deadlines. And then they can seek reimbursement through the closeout period, which goes to, for the districts, it goes to essentially December 30th of each year. And then for the Agency of Education, essentially January 30th of each year. At that point, those funds are, no longer accessed. So, yes, ma'am.
Let me just say, when you say they're obligated, that means it's put down and we've appropriated it and it's sitting in a bank waiting to be used.
Yes.
Or does obligated mean, and I almost think I heard you say that the HVAC work has to be done by this deadline.
Yes.
I mean, with the CARES Act, everything had to be finished by
Yes.
December 30th of 2020.
It had to be finished by September 30th of 2022.
Yeah, well,
Oh, you mean
The very first.
the
group in
coronavirus.
March of 30. Whatever money we got from the feds had to be finished, had to be spent, done.
Yes.
So when you say there's a deadline, the HVAC work has to be finished and done.
Yes.
Or reverse that.
Yes.
But it might not be paid.
Yeah, that's right.
He's obligated, but they might not have paid the bill yet.
That's right. They can continue to pay the invoices through what's called the liquidation period. And that's where it goes out to December 30th for the
Right, so you have
districts.
until from like the September date to
Exactly.
December to finish paying the bills and tie up the last loan.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's why we talk about obligation versus expenditure. And this is part of the sort of, I think, in the national narrative around the ESSER funds, some of the confusion that's coming.
State will play going forward. And on Friday, we'll.
All right.
Breaking news. And
It's all good.
And so what we've seen in sort of
Of how housing and homelessness fit into the state's overall plan. When Governor Scott pitches.
Turn it off.
I thought I had it on mute.
all right. So what we've seen in some of the national narrative, I think, and some of the confusion around ESSER funding is this confusion between obligation and expenditure. So there's been this story of, the districts aren't expending their funds, their districts aren't expending their funds. These are reimbursement grants. So we would not expect them to be expending their funds necessarily by those September 30th deadlines. What we expect them to do is obligate their funds. And that is the really critical sort of message. So if you, for example, we have created, and I'm happy to send you these links as well. We've created some transparency dashboards on our Agency of Education website. Ted and I are very excited about them. It's been our pet project. And so you can go on those dashboards and see both how districts are spending their funds and how the agency is also spending it. And so I'll send you those.
You could send that to Erin.
Absolutely.
Get it to us. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. And so if you look on those dashboards, what you might see right now is that the ESSER 2 funds, it would say something like there's $114 million for the districts and they've only expended 70 million, meaning they sought reimbursement and the Agency of Education has paid 70 million. However, that's not really telling the story. The districts were required to fully budget their allocations last year and have fully approved awards from the Agency of Education, and many of them have fully obligated their ESSER 2. So they actually do have a plan for how they're going to expend these funds, and they're in the process of doing it. But if we only look at reimbursements, we're not getting the full story. So what you'll see on the dashboards is that we show you how much money has been expended, but we also show you what's in their budgets. And what's in their budgets is what they will be reimbursed for. So that will actually give you the full picture of how they're planning to spend their funds. So that's all lots of background, and I'm very happy to dive deeper if you have more questions on this.
Trying to be aware of the time.
Exactly.
We get to the information.
The actual Budget Adjustment Act. So that's all the context. So what is our request in the Budget Adjustment Act? So we are specifically looking at those state level funds, which were appropriated by the legislature through its authority to do so in a series of acts since 2021. There's been, 8 or 9 of them. And what those appropriations have done is they've laid out some very specific priorities that the legislature, in partnership with the governor's office, the Agency of Education, other agencies and departments and stakeholder groups, what are the priorities for these state level funds? The challenge now is that we are now in the process of doing all of that work. But if there is any funds left over in a specific appropriation, we put a project out to bid and the contract comes in under budget. We have a grant program that's in Act 112 specifically for mental health supports for students, and it might be undersubscribed by $60,000. At this point, the agency can't move a penny, right? So we don't have the ability to sort of stuff those funds back into the state level pot and then sort of redeploy them to impactful programs that the legislature has already identified or priorities. So that's what this request is. It's some language that would give us some flexibility to do so. We drafted it in partnership with the Joint Fiscal Office, and it's in line with some of the language that existed in the Coronavirus Relief Fund and also in some other ARPA SFRF programs. So we're not inventing a new wheel here. we're sort of leveraging some language that already exists. So on slide 3 and 4, you can see the proposed language, and I think you all went through this with discussion as well. Essentially, it's saying what are the acts that are impacted here, and as I said, there's 8 or 9 of them over the past 2 years, and that we would be able to do a reconciliation process on the, and I will just say 40 plus initiatives that we have going through these state set aside dollars. So there's a lot of work happening. And so it would allow us, as we finalize a contract, as we finish awarding grants, to identify if there is sort of money in the couch cushions, as I like to say, and be able to pull it back in. It also identify sort of our responsibility for transparency here. So there would be reports to the Joint Fiscal Committee in October of 2023 to sort of give a status check. This is where we're at, particularly with the ARP ESSER funds, which go for another year, and then a final sort of status check and reconciliation in October of 2024. And then there's an explanation, which I've just given you, which is essentially the purpose here is to ensure that we're able to fully expend these funds and that we are not going to revert any funds back to the federal government, which is, I think, something we all want to avoid. And then I also just want to identify that the intent here is to work within the legislative priorities that have already been laid out over the past 2 years. So if we've identified that literacy, mental health supports, school facilities, remote and hybrid learning, high quality instruction, summer and after school, those are some of the major high level priorities that have been themes of all of the legislative acts. So those would be the kinds of things that we would be pointing to. It also gives us the opportunity to measure impact, right? That's been one of the really critical pieces is we haven't had a lot of data up to this point, nationally, at the local level, at the state level, what's working. So as we identify what's working, we're able to take those extra funds and point them towards those impactful programs. And then the last thing I'll say is just about the admin piece. So when I was working on this language and sort of identified this as a need, one of the places that we could potentially move some funds would be in the ARP ESSER admin, that 1.4 million. So as I start looking out into sort of summer and fall of this year, if we're seeing that we're not going to be able to use all those funds for admin because frankly, we've largely absorbed this work within AOE staff, so we haven't added a lot of positions. I would really like to be able to move those funds back up into the state level pot so that we can use them. We wouldn't want those to sort of go to waste. At this point, you'll see on slide 5, this is a very rough estimate. I'm estimating about $3 million potentially across the 40 plus initiatives where we might have some extra money. But I would really not want to be tied to the tracks on that one. That sort of reconciliation will be happening. And part of that is because, as you can see on slide 6, we have 8 grant programs that are live right now, meaning we have awarded funds and they are in flight or we're in the process of awarding those funds. So we asked our grantees to do annual reports so that we can understand that they are fully expending their funds and what are those activities and what's working. And then we also have 12 live or planned contracts. So we are busy right now. We have RFPs going out the door. And so we don't know, whether or not those are going to come in under budget, which would be great. So once those have settled, we'll have a much better picture.
And Jill, just to clarify, when you say ARP ESSER, you mean what we think of as ESSER?
ESSER 3, yeah.
ESSER 3, okay.
Absolutely right.
Okay, so you're saying that about 3 million, give or take, is where you think you might want to reallocate the money to existing programs?
That's exactly right. And it tends to be really small amounts. So, that we budgeted for a $70,000 contract and it came in at 65. Those kinds of, as I call it, the couch cushion money.
Representative Mahali.
Does the 3 million include $1.4 million in admin for ESSER.
Yes, and we'll expend some of that admin.
Yeah,
It's,
sure.
as I said, it's my contracted staff that keeps me,
Yeah.
that keeps me sane. But I think that that is one of the places that I've identified that we might be able to move some funds.
Thank you.
One of the other places I would say is the Act 72 facilities work. And within Act 72, the big ticket items have been the facilities inventory and the facilities assessment, which is in flight right now. Those are budgeted and contracted. In Act 72, there was also identified some funds to hire positions and limited service or contracted positions. We've really been challenged to find qualified staff to do that. And so for the most part, we've absorbed the work. So that would be another place that we would be able to potentially sort of suck some funds back up.
Thank you. Representative Dolan.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And thank you for your testimony here. Just a couple of questions to clarify. So this budget adjustment is just to affect this current fiscal year, correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then-
And sorry, actually, let me restate that. I think that we would want that flexibility through, fiscal year 2024 as well. My concern would be if we don't have this flexibility, that I would need to come back in next January. And at that point, if the legislature decided that it wanted to go in a different direction, to be frank, we probably wouldn't have time to execute successfully, given the timelines. So the idea here would be that this language would carry through, because it's
Not money, it's
Act 20.
money move. I mean,
Yeah,
it's money within their own pot, the money that's been allocated to them. They just want to reallocate it within approved places that we've said are okay. So the language would cover till the end of the ESSER lifespan so that they could use up all the.
Because this is amending the code. Once that, right, it's amending
Act 185.
Act 185.
Yes.
Stays, okay.
Yeah, right.
And the obvious reason for my question is to not tie the hands of a future budget session. So I wanted to just clarify that.
Right. It's just language. Yeah.
Okay, that's right.
And then my second question is in regards to the type of investments. And I see that you have various categories of major initiatives, which is really helpful and really important. Obviously, one of the concerns initially was updating and upgrading the HVAC systems.
Yes.
And infrastructure costs. And since then, as you're aware, with Act 74 that was passed, discovery of PCBs, which can be airborne and exposing people to a toxic carcinogen for an extended period of time if they're. So are you looking at, when you conduct HVAC upgrades, are you also making sure that it would help address potentially any PCB detections through the school testing?
Yes, ma'am. So I happen to be the AOE point person on the PCBs and the school construction. So you're talking to the right person. So I will tell you that one of the challenges here, and you'll hear Secretary French say this as well, is that Act 72, which is the major facilities work, which is funded by $4 million from ARP ESSER 3 state set aside. That had a real sort of progression to it, particularly the facilities assessment, which is underway right now, and that work will be completed by October of this year. So a comprehensive facilities assessment of every public school building in Vermont with dollars attached to it, right? So what are the systems? What is, if you need to replace the roof, what is the dollar amount attached to that? If you need to replace HVAC, et cetera, et cetera. So that all was, sort of a step-by-step progression leading to detailed and actionable information for you all in the future as you're looking at potentially state construction funding. The PCB program came in sort of sideways from that. And so it is challenging to align those two timelines. Working really closely with the team from Department of Environmental Conservation, one of the things that schools are asked to do is identify when they're doing HVAC work or other construction work that may involve like opening walls or opening ceilings where potentially PCB contaminated materials could sort of be released. So that is one place that we are trying to align those two things. The PCB testing goes through June of 2025, much less the remediation that follows from it. The Act 72 work will be wrapped up by 2024, and the district's ESSER 3, their ARP ESSER dollars, also wrap up by 2024. So there is a bit of a misalignment there that we need to bring some coherence to. So PCBs are certainly front and center. I will also say, because I've been diving into down this rabbit hole a really long time on this, those ESSER dollars, those COVID dollars, require a COVID connection. That's sort of the baseline allowability. They're very broad uses, but they're not for everything. So when we're looking at whether or not a project or an investment can be funded at the agency level, looking at the districts, we ask the basic question, how does this prepare, prevent, or respond to COVID? That can be very broad. That covers learning loss and outdoor learning spaces and all kinds of things. The PCB connection needs to be somehow tied in with COVID. And a lot of schools can do that, but it's not a one-to-one connection.
I'm going to stop us here because this is not what we're supposed to be.
No, but my question is, I just don't want to pay for it twice, the same
Right.
twice. That's the
Right.
basic.
Okay. So I'm just looking at the time. We have 1 minute left.
Oh, gotcha.
We'll take a couple last questions. And then what I will say is that Representative Mahali is our contact on this. And if other committee members have more questions, they can go through him and he will be finding out the other information. But we'll take one last question from Rep. Holcomb.
First of all, I just need to state that by your numbers, what you just provided, you used about $1 million in overhead, administrative overhead, to manage $343 million in expenditures. And that's amazing. So I just want to first of all say thank you. That's amazing. I just deserve kudos for that. Thank you. And also it's mostly committed, which is amazing. I mean, the residual is very small.
Yes.
So that's amazing. I want to know how that worked. And did you see, were there any patterns in who had trouble locally figuring out how to allocate these dollars? What can we learn from your success with this?
Yes, so I would say that there's 3 challenges that our districts are facing, and they're the same challenges faced at the agency and nationally, and I'll say it as quickly as I can, Rich. So the 3 challenges that we see are administrative capacity to just handle it. So we've been challenged at the Agency of Education. A huge thank you needs to go to our program and business office staff that have just absorbed it and really have put in a tremendous amount of work. But the districts face the same thing, and it really creates a capacity challenge to do really strategic thinking, to take the deep breath, to be out of emergency mode, and to move towards strategic planning. And I would be happy at any point to come in and talk about the work that we're doing to support them in the FY25 budget cycle, which is sort of our next big piece of work that we need to look at. And then the second major thing is that they've planned for what they want to do, but that doesn't mean that they're not challenged to actually implement it. So staffing shortages, vendor shortages, being able to find highly qualified vendors to do professional development, facilities work, that continues to be a serious challenge. And we are not getting the kind of relief and flexibility from the federal government that we really benefit from. So those are, and I'll just leave it at those. Those are the 2 major challenges.
Just to verify, were any districts unable to allocate?
They have fully budgeted their awards. That was a requirement for the ARP ESSER as of November 1st, and they've done that successfully. Whether or not they can expend them is the big question. And there are some districts that have a large amount of funding, and that will be sort of the question of whether or not they can pivot as they are challenged to actually implement what they thought they were going to do.
Great.
Yep.
I'm sure we could listen to you for a lot longer and get more questions. Thank you very much, Jill, for coming in. We really appreciate it. As I said, your contact is Rep. Mahali.
Yep.
Final questions to him?
All right, fantastic. Thank you all so much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
So next up, we have the Department of Environmental Conservation. We done, and Commissioner Bailing, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly or not, but you'll tell me. And friends.
Good morning. My name is John Beeling. I'm the Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation.
Great. And before we get started, Commissioner, why don't we introduce ourselves so you know who the people are at the table? We'll start in the other direction this time.
Pat Brennan, Colchester.
Plumley, Burlington.
Tristan Tolino, Brattleboro.
Karen Dolan, good morning. Duxbury, Facein, Moortown, Waitsfield, and Warren.
Lynn Dickinson, St. Albans Town.
Mark Mahali, Callis, Plainfield, Marshfield.
Trevor Squirrel, Underhill and Jericho.
Woody Page, Newport.
Rebecca Holcomb, Norwich, Stratford, Sharon, and Beth.
And Robin Scheid from Middlebury. And I believe your contact on this committee is Representative Squirrel.
So this morning, I'm here to talk to you about a new endeavor that we're about to embark on, taking a look at the presence of PFAS. I'm assuming everybody's familiar with PFAS here. I can talk a little bit about it. It's a man-made chemical. It has serious health effects. It is called a forever chemical because it's extremely persistent in the environment. A lot of contaminants will naturally break down. So it's out there, it's going to stay out there. We've been addressing it in a variety of media since really 2016 when the Bennington crisis really broke. We've got a very good handle on its presence in public drinking water supplies. We're looking at it in a bunch of other areas. But one gap that we have is private wells. And there's a large percentage of Vermonters who rely on private wells for their drinking water supply. The only place we've really looked at that is in Bennington in association with the release there. And a number of homeowners in Bennington were not, it wasn't amenable or wasn't really possible to hook them up to the public water supply down there. And so the response for that was to install what's called a point of entry treatment system, a POET system, which is a system right at the house itself. So the monies that we're seeking here today are really twofold. One is to start looking at this problem. Initially, I think today, actually, we're going to be sending out 700 letters to Vermonters asking for voluntary participation in private well sampling. We hope to get 500 yeses and to use that information. So that the impetus for that effort, in addition to really wanting to get a handle on this from a regulatory perspective, is you may be aware, excuse me, that the state has sued 3M and DuPont for failure to warn, basically, about PFAS. And one component of that case is to take a look at the impact on private wells. Since there isn't much data on that, we really need to get a handle on the problem. And the experts have advised us they need about 500 samples to do a statistically meaningful analysis and modeling and so prepare an estimate for the court how many homes are affected. But we need to do this anyway. I mean, that's kind of what pushed us, but this is something that we really need to do. So we want to get out there, start sampling wells, and then the next phase of the process, so that costs money, and then the next phase of the process, we expect there's going to be PFAS in a number of these wells based upon our experience statewide. We'll be very shocked if we have no, exceedances, but that number is not, we don't know exactly what that's going to be. We're using estimates based upon what we do know about the presence of PFAS in the environment. So what we would like to do, and we think is really essential, is to help these folks. We don't want to just take samples and say, good luck. So just so you know, in Bennington, St. Gobain paid for the installation of those systems. So we had a viable party that we could point to and pay for that. A lot of places in the state, that's just not the case. This isn't a typical pollutant, right? Lots of times, if you have a pollutant, you can figure out where it comes from. solvents, things of that nature, petroleum. You can usually find a source in the area and then pursue the people who are legally responsible for it and have them pay for it. It's not the case with PFAS in most situations. It is in some, but not in a lot. It's not. That's been our experience. Even like the public drinking water supplies, it's very difficult to pinpoint where this is coming from. So we propose to have the state fund the installation of the POET system on those properties. But that's just round one, right? We're not going to stop there. And so for every well where we find a detection above, the regulatory limits, we're going to need to keep looking, right? We don't just stop and say, well, that's it. So we'll need to start expanding the scope in that area. And we expect we'll add additional homes by, taking that effort. So the principal costs are the installation of the POET system and investigatory costs. We think the $3 million will get us started down this path. It's difficult to assume or predict exactly where this is going to lead us. If you look at what's happened in New Hampshire, it's pretty scary. We're hoping that's not where we're going to end up. Southern New Hampshire has a major problem with PFAS in private wells. A lot of that is attributable to St. Gobain, and they had a major operation down there. We're hopeful that that's not what we're going to find. We don't have a lot of these plants. Most of what we're finding really comes from us. It comes from consumer products. This is a very ubiquitous substance. It's used in things like Gore-Tex, Scotchgard. Most of the PFAS that they find in Coventry comes from textiles, comes from couches. So it's a tricky and difficult substance to really to try to address, just because it is so prevalent in our society. So that's really where we're headed with this. I think we're really just at the beginning, unfortunately, but I think it's an important regulatory action that we can take to try to help people and prevent unnecessary health risks.
Thank you. And we have a question, Rep. Squirrel.
Yeah, just a couple quick questions about sort of the process. How are you deciding where these letters are going to? How are you determining where? Is it statewide, or are you sort of focusing on where you've seen results before? My second question is, if you get 500 yeses, you have some sense of what the number might be, and I understand that you must have some idea what you might think will come out of that.
So for the first part, we did take a very hard look and worked with the experts, frankly, in determining the areas, but it is statewide. And so we're trying to be very mindful. We don't want to just look in an urbanized area where we'll probably find more. We want to look all across the state. So it is going to be statewide. The second one, are you asking how many yeses we think we're going to get?
How many positive results you might get from 500?
Out of the 500. So we're using 15%. And again, I won't call it a guess, but it's a fair estimate. I hope it comes lower.
And that's what's driving your request for the number.
The 15%, I think, is a reasonable number. New Hampshire is higher than that. I don't know their exact numbers, but it's higher than that. So at least in certain parts of the state, I should say. But that's kind of what we're operating off of. Again, we're all hoping it's less than that. But, the truth, we'll find it.
Thanks. I have Representative Dolan and then Representative Mahali.
Good morning. I also want to extend our appreciation and thanks for the department. You've done an exceptional job in Bennington and looking at spills generally across the state. And hats off and thank you for your attention to this. My question is about the Environmental Contingency Fund that we're leaning on to support this work. And when I see the trends in terms of here we have PFAS, we just earlier talked about PCBs, we have ongoing spills or emergency response needs relating to spills of contamination. We have our ongoing work of whether it be Superfund related and likewise. So, but we keep leaning on the Environmental Contingency Fund. What is the source of funding generally for the Environmental Contingency Fund, and when was that established? And have we updated that source to help provide the sustainability of that fund over time?
So I think I'm going to have to lean on my division director. He's much more well-versed in the...
Friend, and they can join us at the table. Just introduce yourself, sir.
So for the record, my name is Matt Chapman. I'm the director of the Waste Management Prevention Division. So the Environmental Contingency Fund is basically made up. The primary revenue source for it is a tax on hazardous waste. So when people generate hazardous waste as a part of business operations in the state of Vermont, they're taxed on it. And that tax is deposited within the ECF. We have been successful over the years of reducing the amount of hazardous waste that we generate. That's part of the goal of the agency, to basically reduce those waste streams. The unfortunate incident impact associated with that is it also reduces the revenue coming into the ECF. The other sort of major component to the ECF, and Commissioner Dealing mentioned it, is cost recovery from historic spills, right? So when we spend this money, we take every effort we can to identify the person who released it into the environment and make them pay for the costs associated with that. Sometimes the problems are significant enough where we feel as the state we need to step in and basically protect public health. And in those instances, we use the fund and then go back and seek that recovery in a cost section later. And then the last thing, and I'm very appreciative of it, is that both the legislature has come in and done a number of one-time transfers to the ECF to basically satisfy the long-term deficits that exist with respect to the obligations. But I think it's fair, and I think Representative Bowen is aware, I mean, the long-term obligations associated with the fund outstrip the revenue that's coming into it.
So when was the actual tax on hazardous waste established? And have we tried to keep up with inflation?
Well, so I don't know off the top of my head when the tax, I'm happy to look back and tell you when that was. In the 20 years plus that I've worked for the agency, we have not adjusted the tax on hazardous waste.
And one
last question. Yeah.
One last question. Okay. When you talk about one-time transfers, what are you transferring from where to where? And what's the opportunity cost of that transfer to the giving fund?
So I think there's and I should probably go back and there are two transfers that take place. One is the transfer that the legislature pays of general fund dollars, and you move them from one-time surpluses that the legislature has identified into the ECF to address identified needs, much like what this proposal is today. And then there's an additional opportunity to transfer that I didn't mention, which is we can transfer funds from our solid waste management assistance fund, which is a fund dedicated to help solid waste management, to the environmental contingency fund. Part of the rationale for that is that many of our biggest contaminated sites are basically our old mines and old landfills that would fall into the bucket of being related to solid waste. We have not done that for a long time. And part of that is we've really tried to be focused on using it when there's a related sort of nexal issue between solid waste and sites management. So.
Okay.
So to answer your question, I did take a look. It looks like it was probably established in 1980. Most of these state Superfund laws passed around the same time as the federal Superfund law. So that would be my estimate looking at the statute itself. Looks like that's when it started.
Thank you. Thanks. Next, we have Representative Mahaly, followed by Representative Holcomb.
We've been working on this for a while, which is really great. Why is this part of budget adjustment not near? What's new? What's changed since the budget was put together, the 23 budget?
As I mentioned, I think the trigger, I mean, we've obviously been thinking about this for a while, but the real trigger was the litigation. I mean, we're in the middle of a case. I think trial is set for 2025. We're in the midst of discovery. So really the timing was that's what spurred us into this, but it's not obviously solely because of litigation, but that's really what kind of made us.
When was the litigation brought?
We filed in, was it 21? That's not right. I think it was 2021.
So what's happened is the lawyers are telling you we need more evidence.
That's part of it, yes. I mean, the experts have said that, but, we've been aware of this situation. ever since Bennington. Obviously, when we started looking in Bennington, where we looked, we found a lot. So, excuse me, incrementally, you recall, I mean, what we started with the public drinking water supplies, and that was a major effort. We got them all tested. We have a sense of which ones are contaminated. There's a bunch of treatment systems in place on those systems. So this is kind of the logical next step. And if you look around New England, this is what most states have been doing. They start with the bigger systems and then start looking out at the private ones.
Thank you. Thank you. Representative Holcomb, followed by Representative Page.
I just need a really quick clarification on how the hazardous waste tax works. Where do you tax PFAS and PCBs? For example, is it done at point of purchase or is it just done through this landfill? I'm trying to figure out where in the waste cycle it happened.
Sure, the tax is applied on the disposal of hazardous waste. Again, I would need to get the books and actually give you a detail. It's a fairly complicated tax. It is both the nature of the waste and what is being done with it is what sets the tax rate for the tax on hazardous.
So from a consumer's perspective, when they throw away the couch, it's borne by the home.
So this is a tax, and I think it's good to draw a distinction between what's classified as solid waste and what's classified as hazardous waste. So hazardous waste.
I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. The PFAS. I think that you're saying that the PFAS are ubiquitous in textiles, but if it's only at the point of Woody's landfill, how does that mark it? You get my point. It's up in Newport. We only got two.
Oh, and for the record, it's not a Newport, but we can see it in Covington.
But I'm just trying to figure out how, if a tax is a tool to change behavior, how does this tax change our consumption of PFAS and PCBs?
For PFAS, where we're seeing it is typically what Matt's referring to is really what you think of as hazardous. It's an industry produces, used solvents, something like that. That has to go to a special facility that's taxed. Couches are not taxed as hazardous waste, even though we know now that
they're hazardous. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. The representative without a landfill, Representative Page.
Actually, we do use that service.
I was pretty sure.
I was curious. Are you also testing municipal wells?
That's what I'm talking about. When I say public drinking water supplies, that would fit within, if it's.
So all municipalities, you're testing their wells?
Any public drinking water system has been tested.
Okay. And then I think it's wonderful that you're doing the remediation, but that remediation doesn't completely eliminate all the chemicals, does it?
No.
So, and how many would be eliminated? It's just a handful, as I recall.
You mean houses? I mean, how many?
Yeah, houses.
So, if we use the 15%, again, this is something of an unknown, right? We just really don't know at this point. So we're going to find out, right? So we just, we'll have a sense once we start testing how many are coming in with above the 20 parts per trillion.
And what do you do for those that do come back? Are you going to provide drinking water? How are you going to fix that?
So that's where we would install a point of entry treatment system, which is what we did in Bennington. So it's just a system that treats the water before it comes into the household.
But it doesn't eliminate everything.
It'll treat it to the point where it's below standards. Right. And I think they're effective. I mean, POET systems are effective at getting the numbers to where they're safe, but, I mean, there's no, I mean, I don't know that we can get to zero. Matt might know. I don't know where, I mean, we always test after you install a POET, you go in and you test to make sure it's working. And we wouldn't, we would do more if it turned out it's not treating it effectively.
It's a filter.
These are generally filter systems, GAC systems.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Rep. Dolan?
Since they're filtered systems with activated carbon, I presume you have to replace the carbon every 6 months. Who pays for that?
That is a very good question. So it's a significant number. Just to give you a sense, that is pretty much the same cost as the installation of the POET system.
So that could be increase exponentially in
Yes.
terms of cost.
Yes,
That's for the litigation.
we're wrestling with that.
So we don't know how much one carbon filter costs to,
But we have a good sense of what the capital costs are, and then we know how much the disposal costs are, and they're very significant replacement.
are we talking in the hundreds of dollars every?
So I think the numbers that we've got here, I've got a spreadsheet. Installation costs are around $3,400 per system, and then the what we call operation and maintenance, it's about the same. It's around 2,500 to
Every 6 months.
6 months.
It's once a year. It's once a year.
Okay, so it's once a year.
Okay, but not cheap. Great. Are there any other questions about this? So this is $3 million. And we do have a question, Representative.
Okay, when you're looking at $3,400 per system and $2,500 to start with maintenance and operations for many, 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 many private wells, when you sit down and start looking at public water systems, how long is it going to take, if the state's going to pay for this or contribute, I mean, the homeowners would have to pay for it if you don't pay for it.
Right.
How long does it take before you start to figure out that maybe it's better to put water and sewer and when's the cost effective return on investment here?
Putting in water and sewer is always preferable. It's
not
just,
cheap,
it's
but
not, well, it's also not really viable in a lot of parts of Vermont. It's just not available. So it really depends.
Yeah. And would it matter if you wanted to dig a new well?
You mean in terms of,
If you can't get the PFAS out of this, if it's, I mean, let's say you have 10 acres.
right,
Can you go to another part of your property? I mean, because those are the ones you really can't get to for
Right.
public water. I mean, if you got a couple of houses on a street, you could want to,
replacement wells are a possibility. There's no guarantee that you're going to find a clean well even on a 10-acre parcel. You might.
okay. Just trying to get a
No,
scenario here that what are we looking at?
This is something that came up a lot in Bennington. A lot of people, that was what they were trying to, it's difficult.
everywhere.
It's very ubiquitous.
Once you got it.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if you had a bunch of houses along Route 7
sure. If
out in the
you,
country, you could run a line.
yeah,
That would be cost effective.
if there's public water available, that's definitely a very good option.
Thank you.
Great. Well, some of us may get letters from you. I will say yes if I get a letter.
You know who you have to send your letters to.
So anything else anybody has? Yes.
Yeah, the $3 million that's already in here, this is your request, right?
Yes.
Just wanted to double check on that. Thank you.
So if we have additional questions, we go through Rep. Squirrel, who will be doing a deeper dive as needed. And I think we're good for now. And the floor is about to start if people want to go there. If you do, we need to be back a little before 10 so we can have our next guest.
Thank you.